Hello, everyone. Tonight, we begin with the surprisingly common human urge to open skulls, to let the bad thoughts out. Yes, this is a story about medicine, but not the kind with stethoscopes and white coats. We're talking about sharpened stone, no anesthesia, and the sincere belief that if someone starts acting strange, the best solution is to carve a hole in their head and hope the demon takes the hint. From Neolithic caves to Incan surgical suites, people have been scraping bone away like it's mold on bread. From children trepanned before they could read, to warriors who walked around with 3 holes and a reputation for surviving what gods couldn't fix. From fermented beer as antiseptic to skull fragments worn as jewelry, because apparently, nothing says spiritual hygiene like carrying a piece of your own forehead in a pouch. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy ancient medical procedures that sound more like horror than healing. It helps more than you know. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? Are you curled up in bed, washing dishes, pacing slowly while wondering if your own ancestors might have tried this on a headache? Now, dim the lights, let the room go quiet. Maybe put on some tea or something stronger. No judgment, and let's drift back to a time when survival was sacred, and the skull was just a door waiting to be opened. Let me tell you about the person you could have been. You've got a headache, not acute, modern headache caused by your phone's brightness or that third espresso shot you definitely didn't need. No, you're living about 7,000 years ago, and your skull's pulsing like the gods are throwing dice in there. There's no ibuprofen, no doctor's note, no quiet room with a weighted blanket. Just you, a pounding head, and a local healer who smells like smoke, dried goat fat, and certainty. In this world, pain isn't a symptom, it's a story. And your headache, oh, it's not a neurological issue. It's spiritual congestion. Something or someone is inside your head. A spirit, a demon, a wind, or maybe your dead uncle who never did know when to shut up. Whatever it is, it's stuck, and it needs a way out. You're lead into a hut or a cave or a stone circle that absolutely reeks of mystery and bad ventilation. You're not asked for consent. You're not given a diagnosis. Instead, you're told the solution with all the confidence of a man who's only seen 2 things: fix a person, fire, or a hole in the skull. And today, he's out of fire. Trepanation they call it. Though, let's be honest, they didn't call it anything. You're not given a Latin term. You're given a stone knife, a fur to bite, and some vague encouragement that you'll feel better once the spirits escape. They don't really care about the headache. They care about what might happen if they don't act. You see, you're not just ill, you're contagious, cosmically. If that spirit leaks out in the wrong direction, someone else could end up possessed. Maybe the goat, maybe the chief. You don't want that, do you? So they sit you down. Maybe you're tied. Maybe you're held gently, which, in ancient medical terms, means immobilized by force. And someone, a shaman, a priest, your cousin who sharpens bones for a living, begins scraping away at your skull like it's a burnt pot. It's not a quick process. They don't drill, they scrape. Tiny flakes of bone, one by one, as they slowly wear through the surface of your forehead, or your crown, or the soft curve behind your temple, depending on where the demons are loitering. No anesthesia. At best, they've blown some fermented mushroom powder into your face, or made you chew bitter roots until you forget your name. At worst, they just hope you scream less than the last guy. And here's the fun part. The tool they're using might be older than you, might have scraped 3 other skulls this year. They rinse it in river water, maybe. They bless it, they blow smoke on it, but they don't sterilize it. Sterile wasn't a concept yet. If it didn't kill the last patient, it's considered perfectly good for your head. Blood drips, the bone thins, and somewhere during the process, you either pass out or ascend into a state of divine confusion. The healer nods solemnly. He sees this as a good sign. The spirit is leaving. Your body jerks. Another good sign. Your ancestors are assisting. He finally breaks through, gently prying away a coin-sized disc of your skull, and everyone breathes out. The pressure's relieved. The demon's been given an exit. The wind is free, and you're probably not. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Because this isn't an isolated quirk of one obscure village with too much time and too few herbs. No, this ritual, This idea of slicing open a skull to treat what can't be seen, it's global. See, once they've made the decision to cut into your skull, the next big question is, with what? And here's where things get even more comforting. Because your brain, that delicate lump of ambition, memory, and mostly fear at this point, is about to meet the sharp edge of a rock. Yes, stone. Not just any stone. A sacred one, probably. Sharpened flint, obsidian, maybe a bit of jagged quartz, if they're feeling fancy. You know, the kind of tools that were originally used to skin animals or slice tree bark, now being repurposed for brain access. Because who wouldn't trust their cranial well-being to a tool older than written language? Obsidian was a favorite, and to be fair, it's incredibly sharp, sharper than modern surgical steel in some cases. Razor-thin, glassy, volcanic, and about as forgiving as a broken wine glass in a foot race. And flint, oh flint, was the Swiss Army knife of its time. Fire starter, weapon, and now, congratulations, neurosurgical instrument. And here's the charming part. This wasn't some quick swipe. You weren't getting a clean modern cut with antiseptic gauze and a trained hand. No, it was slow, painstaking work. They didn't drill, they scraped, layer by layer. Bone dust in your hair metal. Rare, expensive, reserved for warriors or rich corpses. For most people, it was stone and determination. In Neolithic Europe, the edges of the blades show signs of repeated use. We know this because archaeologists have found blade marks on skulls that overlap, like someone paused halfway through the procedure and picked up a sharper rock, or worse, dropped it. And let's not forget the bone tools. Yes, bone. Sometimes from animals, sometimes not. A sharpened rib, a splintered femur, the ancient version of DIY medical equipment. You wouldn't know if the edge had last been used to carve a drumstick or open your cousin's head. It didn't matter. The tool was sacred and likely passed down through generations, along with the family curse. Now, if you're imagining a well-lit tent and a soft bed of grass, please stop. Picture a smoke-filled hut, a pit in the ground, maybe some ceremonial ash, no clean water, no gloves, no scalpel trays, just hands, stone, and hope. There are skulls, real skulls, thousands of years old, that show evidence of multiple surgeries. Some had 2, 3, even 4 holes carved into them. And get this, they survived. The bone grew back. Not always neatly, but enough to say, yep, I lived through that. So either they were incredibly lucky, or, and this is far more likely, the people doing the cutting actually knew what they were doing. Not in the textbook way, but in the I've-seen-15-heads-n-11-lived way, which, statistically, is surprisingly good. And the tools, they weren't just implements, they were ritual objects, cleaned, blessed, sometimes buried with the patient, or kept in bundles wrapped in cloth, animal hide, or feathers. You didn't just find them lying around. They had meaning, they had lineage, they had names, and yet no one was measuring blood loss. No one was calculating infection risk. If your scalp got warm, if your breath went shallow, if your eyes rolled back, that was the spirit talking, or leaving, or deciding whether to take you with it. But you're still sitting there, head open, airbrushing bone, flies interested, and your surgeon's just begun to hum. Because now comes the sacred part, figuring out what, exactly, was supposed to come out of that hole. Now, if you're starting to think this whole brain-scooping business was just the hobby of one particularly over-enthusiastic village tucked between some forgotten hills, oh no, not even close. The real plot twist, everyone was doing it. Trepanation, that charming hobby of opening skulls while hoping for spiritual relief, was one of the few medical practices that popped up independently all over the world. No trade routes, no shared texts. Just an eerily consistent human impulse to treat problems of the mind by poking a hole in the head and letting the badness float out. Start in Neolithic Europe, France, Denmark, Ukraine. Archaeologists have dug up skulls with carefully carved holes, some as large as silver dollars, others like coin slots for invisible demons. The oldest examples are over 7,000 years old, which is far older than writing metal tools, or your aunt's favorite garlic remedy. And these weren't crude gashes either. The bone edges were smoothed, deliberate. Some showed clear signs of healing, meaning the patients lived, for a while at least. Hop continents and you land in Peru, where pre-Columbian surgeons took trepanation to an entirely new level. Not only were they doing it routinely, they were doing it well. The Inca and their predecessors performed thousands of skull surgeries. One study of over 800 trypan skulls from Peru found survival rates upwards of 80 to 90% during certain periods. That's better than 19th century European battlefield medicine, by the way. And they didn't have penicillin. They had corn, beer, and grit. In Papua New Guinea, it wasn't just curative, it was preventative. Some groups believed that trepanation protected against spiritual invasion or lingering ancestral wrath. It was proactive medicine, like a flu shot, only instead of a needle, you got a ceremonial chisel to the skull. Even China had ancient records of skull openings, often linked to demonic affliction or internal wind. In Tibet, trepanation was sometimes performed to liberate trapped spirits. In Africa, both West and East, you find cases tied to madness, trauma, and ritual purification. Some scholars argue that in certain tribes, the hole was a mark of healing, almost a badge of survival, a literal open mind. And then there's Polynesia, where skulls have been found with small, deliberate perforations, possibly linked to combat injury or spiritual cleansing. Again, isolated cultures, no connection, same conclusion. If the head is troubled, it must be opened. This wasn't just medicine, it was cosmic maintenance. Illness wasn't seen as internal failure, it was external invasion by spirits, demons, or ancestral grudges, and the only way to solve it, give them a door. What's most chilling or impressive, depending on how you feel about scalpels made of stone, is how consistently people survived. You'd think punching a hole in someone's skull with a flint tool would be a fast track to an early grave, but nope. They lived, they healed. Their skulls grew back, forming a calcified frame around the hole, like the bone was trying to forget what happened, and in many cases, they did it more than once. There are skulls with 2, 3, 4 holes each, neatly spaced like someone was adding ports for divine Wi-Fi. So no, this wasn't an accident. It wasn't a fringe ritual. It was a global instinct. Somehow, across millennia and oceans, humans everywhere decided that if the mind was disturbed, the cure was simple. Open the head, let it out. And if you're still sitting upright after that, well, you've just unlocked the next question. What exactly were they trying to fix? Here's where things get personal. Because you, dear listener, are not suffering from bacteria, or neurological inflammation, or post-traumatic stress. No, your body isn't malfunctioning, it's misbehaving. Or worse, it's haunted. And the only thing more terrifying than a bad diagnosis is an invisible one with a backstory. See, there was no such thing as disease the way we think of it now. Germ theory was a distant dream. Cells, never heard of them. Parasites, maybe. But what really got you sick was bad energy. Angry gods, malevolent winds, or spirits that entered through your dreams and nested behind your eyes. If you had seizures, they didn't call it epilepsy. They said you'd been touched by a demon. If you had migraines, they weren't hormonal, they were ancestral punishment. If you saw things that weren't there, that wasn't psychosis, that was a possession. Sometimes by your own dead relatives, sometimes by something far older, with no name, only teeth. The logic was airtight. You acted strange, gives something entered you, gives it needed to leave. What's the fastest way out? A hole in the skull. It wasn't primitive, it was precise, in its own terrifying way. Pain was a message, madness was an invader, and physical trauma, that wasn't just an injury, it was a cosmic crack. You needed spiritual recalibration, and nothing said realignment quite like slicing into your cranial vault to let the chaos out. Sometimes, the hole wasn't just an exit. It was a trap, a way to lure the spirit toward the opening and contain it, or confuse it, because apparently, some spirits weren't great with spatial awareness. Other times, the hole was permanent, left open to allow flow, because heaven forbid your skull gets stuffy. In ancient Europe, they believed that drilling the skull could release the vapors that caused insanity. Yes, vapors, mysterious evil gases that floated in your brain like a bad perfume and needed to be aired out. Your head was basically a haunted attic. Trepanation was ventilation. In some cases, trepanation was used to undo a curse. Imagine that. Your neighbor gets sick, the local diviner blames you, and the only way to prove your innocence is to let someone scoop out a piece of your forehead. Congratulations, you've just been spiritually audited. And the procedure wasn't always done by someone you'd call a doctor. It could be a shaman, a midwife, a warrior, or the old woman who lived near the cliff and talked to birds. They weren't trained in anatomy. They were trained in omens, in dreams, in how blood flows when the spirit is ready to leave. There was no concept of sanitation, but there was ritual, smoke, chanting, animal blood, herbs burned on coals. You might have been painted first, or offered a blessing, or had your forehead sprinkled with goat milk and prayer ash. And then, down came the blade. This wasn't about healing as we know it. It was about cleansing, about proving worth, about showing the spirit world that you were willing to suffer to make things right. And if the gods liked you, you lived. If not, well, your skull still told the story. And in some places, your skull kept telling it, because they didn't throw away the part they cut out. Oh no, that little coin of bone had a second life. Let me put it this way. If you're expecting comfort, you've wandered into the wrong millennium. Because you weren't given warm broth, gentle hands, or a nice soft bed to recover in. You were given pain, thick, holy, meaningful pain, and told to hold still. Pain was part of the treatment, not a side effect, not a problem, a goal. In many of these ancient systems, pain meant the ritual was working. It was the fire that burned the spirit out. The offering your body made to rebalance whatever had gone cosmically sideways inside your skull. You screamed, good. That meant the demon heard you. You passed out. Even better, that meant it left. There's no anesthetic, no local numbing. At best, you get a fermented drink that smells like wet bark and regret. Maybe some opium if you're lucky and born in the right river valley. Otherwise, you're biting a stick, or a leather strap, or the inside of your own cheek while someone saws through your head like they're trying to find the prize in a particularly sacred cereal box. Pain wasn't a medical emergency. It was spiritual proof. The louder you cried, the more evidence that the entity was resisting, and the more reason to keep going. Imagine a surgeon who gets encouraged when you flail. That's what we're dealing with, and people endured it, not just once. There are skulls, real, excavated skulls, with multiple trepanations, done years apart, showing bone regrowth and survival. That means someone went through this horror, survived, had more symptoms, and did it again. Think about that. They weren't running from the blade. They were crawling back toward it, convinced that relief or redemption lay on the other side of the bone. And if you didn't flinch, if you endured it with stoic silence, that wasn't just healing, that was a revelation. You'd proven yourself to the spirits, or the gods, or your community. Depending on the culture, you might be considered blessed, wise, marked, even chosen. There are accounts, especially in Andean societies, of patients being celebrated post-operation, decorated, revered. Your scar wasn't a disfigurement, it was a badge. You'd looked death in the eye, and it flinched first. But not everyone got the applause. Many didn't make it past the scraping. Their skulls show no sign of healing, just clean, precise holes, and then silence. They weren't failures though, they were sacrifices. Sometimes literal. Because let's not forget, pain wasn't always about healing the living. Sometimes it was a gateway for the dying, or the dead. There are skulls that were trepanned after death, just to release lingering spirits, or to keep the body from becoming a vessel for something worse. You weren't just treated when alive, you were also corrected when dead. So no, pain wasn't a problem. It was a ritual currency. The price you paid for clarity, or at least for the chance to stop seeing your uncle's ghost every time you blinked. And once the hole was open and the pain had done its work, then came the belief that something had changed. That you were lighter, clearer, hollowed and healed. But what exactly were they opening up? See, in your world, the skull is biology, protective casing, a glorified helmet for the soft, wet genius sloshing around inside. But in their world, the skull wasn't just bone. It was boundary between body and spirit, life and death, the known and the unspeakably weird. To open the skull was to open the threshold. You weren't just drilling a hole in someone's head. You were inviting the unseen in, or forcing it out. Cultures across time saw the head as sacred territory, the seat of the soul, the throne of breath, the quiet room where thoughts and spirits took tea. The eyes might be the windows to the soul, but the skull, that was the door. And if you thought something nasty had snuck in, a curse, a memory, a god you hadn't invited, you had to pry that door open. Sometimes, the hole wasn't even closed, no stitches, no bone flap, just a permanent opening, left there like a chimney for the soul. An architectural decision to keep the passage open, in case the spirit needed to leave again, or in case something wiser needed to move in, and the piece they removed, that wasn't medical waste, that was relic. Bone discs had been found buried with the patient, or carried as amulets, or ground into powder and mixed into ointments. Yes, applied medicine made from your own skull. Because why take aspirin when you could rub a little purified self back onto your temple? Sometimes they stored the bone disc in a pouch, tied around the neck. Other times it was hung near the bed like a protective charm. And in some cases, the fragment was passed on from healer to apprentice, parent to child. The skull wasn't trash, it was power. In Central Asia, it's believed some trepanation holes were used for spirit communication. The shaman would press their head to yours, aligning portals, or, more disturbingly, they'd blow smoke into the hole. Not metaphorically, literally. Sacred herbs, direct infusion, spiritual fumigation. In certain African traditions, holes in the head were used to anchor the soul. The body was seen as unstable, a container that might crack under stress. The hole stabilized it, like a pressure valve, or a leash for the wandering self. Even in Europe, long after stone tools had been replaced with shiny blades, the idea of the skull as a door persisted. Medieval texts speak of the cranium gate, a place through which influence could pass. Some healers used magnets, others prayers, but the idea never really went away. And here's the eerie bit. In many cultures, the skull hole wasn't seen as a weakness. It was a mark of access, a sign that the person had been opened and had survived it. They were different now, touched, emptied, enlightened, or at least ventilated. But this door wasn't just symbolic. In cases of head trauma, crushed bone, pressure on the brain, it was literal relief. Some skulls show injuries and trepanation side by side. The hole may have saved them, or it may have been a post-mortem experiment. Either way, the bone speaks. And what it says is chilling. They knew just enough to keep trying. And now that the door's open, let's talk about why so many people needed it in the first place. Because spiritual mischief wasn't the only reason to saw your skull open. Sometimes it was just war. Let me tell you about the other person you could have been. A warrior. Or more accurately, a survivor of someone else's very good aim. See, not every trepanation was about demons, dreams, or disturbing visions of your grandmother's ghost. Sometimes it was just about blunt force trauma, a rock to the head, a club, a slingstone, a spear shaft. Ancient combat wasn't neat, and helmets weren't exactly trending yet. So when your skull cracked open on the battlefield, there were two options: die quickly, or lie very still while someone tried to poke the swelling out. In Peru, yes, we're back in the Andes again, because those people knew their way around a skull. Many trepanned heads show evidence of prior injury. Depressed fractures, splintered bone, cleanly healed holes, right next to jagged trauma. This wasn't ritual. This was triage. You'd been whacked, and your brain was filling up with fluid or blood, or pressure that made it hard to breathe, blink, or remember your own name. So the healer did what modern ER surgeons still do today: relieve the pressure. Only they didn't have CT scans, or sterilized bone saws, or medical degrees. Just a flint blade, a lot of confidence, and maybe a few sacred chants whispered in your general direction. There's one skull from the Inca period that had 5 trepanations. 5, and the man lived. Not a scratch and die situation. Full regrowth, meaning someone, at some point, decided he was worth saving. Again, and again, and again. It's not just Peru. Skulls from France, Ukraine, even Northern Africa show similar patterns. Fracture on one side, surgical hole on the other. Like someone looked at the broken bone, thought, that's unfortunate, and then started scraping from the opposite direction. The logic wasn't elegant, but it often worked. In some places, this emergency skull surgery became standard after battle. You staggered home with blood in your hair and confusion in your eyes, and the local healer popped you down on a rock, grabbed their ceremonial spoon, and got to work. You didn't need to be possessed. You just needed to be hit hard enough to worry people. And if you lived, you were a legend. The scar alone got you stories at feasts. The hole meant you'd been through something. Your skull was part war trophy, part spiritual stamp, part medical miracle. Mothers pointed you out to their sons. Girls asked if they could touch it. The village drunk tried to balance beans in it. And if you didn't live, your head still told the story. A clean circle in a battlefield of bone. proof that someone tried, that your pain was seen, that you didn't just bleed out under a tree. You were treated, because trepanation wasn't just for madness, it was for survival. The difference between collapse and resurrection. And for some cultures, it was a kind of rescue mission, a last attempt to pull someone's soul back through the door before it's shut for good. But some places didn't just survive they excelled at it. So let's visit the ancient world's most unexpectedly competent brain surgeons. Now, if you'd been born in the Andean highlands sometime between 1000 BCE and 1500 CE, congratulations, you've just stumbled into the most advanced brain surgery on Earth, without microscopes, without scalpels, and without gloves. It sounds absurd, like saying your grandmother's knitting circle invented heart transplants, but it's true. The pre-Inca and Inca civilizations of ancient Peru, particularly the Paracas, Nazca, and Wari cultures, practiced trepanation at a level that still baffles archaeologists. Not just frequently, not just competently, but with survival rates that would make Civil War surgeons cry into their whiskey. Let's talk numbers. In certain Peruvian burial sites, over 40% of male skulls show signs of trepanation. Some had multiple procedures, sometimes overlapping. And here's the kicker. Over 80% of those skulls show clear signs of bone regrowth, meaning the patient survived. For years, often for decades. Compare that to 19th century Europe, where battlefield trepanation survival rates hovered around 30%. And that's with metal tools and formal training. Meanwhile, your average Andean village healer was out here with obsidian blades and sacred corn beer, casually outperforming the French. So what were they doing differently? First, precision. They didn't gouge or hack. They scraped, slow, controlled, removal of bone layers, using tools so sharp they could split a hair. No cracked skulls, no shattered bone edges, just neat little windows into the mind. Second, experience. You don't get that good by accident. These weren't amateurs, this was a system. Healers trained in the technique, passed it down, refined it. They weren't improvising. They were specialists, neurosurgeons, in alpaca cloaks. Third, cleanliness, at least in their own way. They used antiseptic plants. They drank, and possibly applied chicha, fermented corn beer with mild antibacterial properties. They covered wounds with herbs and soft cloths. Not sterile, no, but not suicidal either. And then there's the question of why. Were they treating head injuries? Yes, war, accidents, ritual duels, but also spiritual imbalance, madness, epilepsy, depression. They believed the skull was both physical and sacred territory. If something was wrong inside, it needed access. Some skulls show not one but 5 or 6 holes, carved across years. Some patients had old wounds re-entered. One man had a full craniotomy and lived a section of his skull completely removed, then healed over like nothing happened. This wasn't emergency butchery. It was deliberate medicine. And more than that, it was a kind of trust, a belief that the body could survive such a violent correction, that pain was part of the healing, that the gods or the ancestors would guide the hand. And so, while medieval Europe was still balancing humors and bleeding patients for sneezing too hard, the Andes had a thriving neurosurgical tradition, quietly saving lives with sharp glass, sacred leaves, and hands trained by generations of ritual and grit. So now that you've had your skull scraped by some of the finest hands in pre-modern history, let's talk about who else got the privilege. Because, surprisingly, it wasn't just warriors and priests. They were smaller than the blades used on them, some barely old enough to walk without toppling, others still clinging to their mother's shawl when the seizures began. A twitch, a silence, a shriek in the middle of sleep. And suddenly, the village knows something's wrong. Not a passing fever, not colic, something inside the child, something watching from behind the eyes. In a world without brain scans or behavioral assessments, a child who didn't act right wasn't different. They were possessed, or cursed, or chosen by something with claws. And when reason fails, the blade begins. Across ancient Peru, Neolithic Europe, parts of Africa and the Pacific, the smallest skulls in burial sites bear the most chilling marks, holes, carefully scraped into still developing craniums. Trepanation was not a procedure reserved for warriors or elders. It was also done to children, regularly. Their skulls were softer, thinner, easier to work with. If you're a person who thinks of skulls the way a carpenter thinks about wood grain, The tools were the same: flint, obsidian, bronze if they had it. The hand was steady, the cut was slow. You don't rush sacred work, even if the patient is squirming under animal hide and panic. Some of these children survived. You can see it in the regrowth, the way bone tries to forget, tries to seal itself, one ring after another, like tree bark. A skull that tells you they lived for a while, but others didn't. The wound is clean, the edges are raw. No healing, no closure, just a surgical attempt, paused forever. And here's the part that sticks in your throat. Some were trepanned twice. You'll find 2 holes, or more, sometimes overlapping, sometimes spaced, like someone was mapping a constellation in the child's head. This wasn't trial and error. This was ritual persistence. The first opening didn't work. Try again. The demons, stubborn. Maybe it moved. You can almost hear the reasoning. If one hole doesn't drive it out, surely a second will convince it to leave. Was it fear? Faith? Desperation? All 3, probably. Some communities saw these procedures as protective, even preemptive. A child who might become sick, a child born under the wrong stars, trepanation as insurance, as if opening the head could open the future. 2. The children weren't condemned. Often they were mourned with care, buried with tokens, sometimes elevated in memory, their scars seen as signs of sacrifice, not suffering. A failed attempt to save a body, perhaps, but maybe a soul saved in the process. And the tools used weren't medical devices. They were holy, passed down, ritualized, blades sharper than steel, sharper than reason, carried by hands that believed pain was better than possession. It wasn't medicine as we know it. It was spiritual architecture. And children weren't exempt from construction. Some were the first stones laid. They didn't come in sterilized packs. There were no white coats, no trays laid out like in a crime drama. These tools were older than hygiene, older than surgery as a concept. And yet, in their own brutal, sacred way, they were exactly right for the job. The earliest was stone, flint, chert, and obsidian, that glossy black volcanic glass that cuts cleaner than a razor and deadlier than most people realize. Obsidian was sacred in many cultures, not just because it looked like night frozen in a blade, but because it split with surgical precision, microscopic sharpness. One wrong move, and it slices to the bone like butter. One right move, and it does the same. These weren't primitive hacksaws, they were ritual instruments. Sometimes they were shaped like small discs. Other times, they resembled scrapers or wedges. Edges were honed, not by machines, but by repetition, napped by hand, inspected by eye, passed down like family heirlooms. A trepanning blade might serve for years, used across generations. And no, it was not retired after use. It was seasoned. The idea of contamination of germs, infection, sterilization, that was centuries away. But there was still a deep awareness that the tool mattered, that it carried presence. These implements weren't neutral objects. They were participants in the healing, extensions of intention, of ritual, of the invisible forces being negotiated. In some cultures the blade was smoked, blessed, named, wrapped in cloth, and stored near altars or sacred springs. In others, it was carried in pouches of animal skin, alongside dried herbs and tokens. You didn't just grab the nearest rock. You chose, you prepared. Even bone tools were used, sharpened fragments of animal ribs or long bones, shaped like tiny gouges or chisels. It's unclear if those were symbolic, practical, or both, but they worked. Some cuts made by bone are cleaner than flint, less brittle, more forgiving on the skull. If anything can be described as forgiving, in the context of slowly peeling back someone's cranium. And occasionally, in richer or later contexts, metal enters the picture. Copper or bronze, but not often. Metal was precious. And oddly, many cultures kept using stone even after metal was available. Why? Because it worked. Because it was sacred. Because old knowledge doesn't let go easily, especially when it draws blood so well. There's a recurring archaeological mystery. Skulls show signs of extremely careful technique, and yet the cultures left behind no written records, no surgical manuals, no diagrams, just the tools, the holes, and the healing, which suggests this wasn't a profession in the modern sense. It was a calling, maybe even a birthright. You didn't train in a school, you inherited the blade. The person who cut your head open wasn't necessarily a doctor. They might have been a shaman, a priest, a diviner, or the local war healer who once saw a god in a dream and never quite came back from it. But they knew what they were doing, or at least believed they did. And often, that belief was enough to keep your soul and your blood inside your body. Because when the stakes are spiritual and the skull is the altar, the tool becomes the sermon. And once the hole was made, the bleeding slowed, and the spirits were satisfied. Well, then someone had to decide if it worked. There was no blood test, no post-op questionnaire, no cheerful nurse asking you to rate your pain on a scale from 1 to 10. No one checked your reflexes or gave you a stress ball. Instead, they watched you closely, like someone waiting for a storm to clear. You'd just had a hole carved into your skull, and now the big question hung in the air like incense. Did it work? The answer wasn't medical, it was behavioral. If you stopped convulsing, you were cured. If you no longer screamed at invisible things, excellent progress. If your mood lifted, if you started eating again, if the light returned to your eyes, the ritual had succeeded. The demon had gone out the way it came in, reluctantly, resentfully, and through bone. In some cases, it wasn't even about change, it was about stability. If you didn't get worse, they called it a miracle. You were now balanced. You might still see spirits, sure, but you weren't biting anyone. That was considered a solid win. Some cultures had very specific signs to look for: a shift in breathing, the return of certain dreams, the moment you could name a god without flinching, the ability to walk 3 steps without falling over. Small things, profound things, and sometimes the only proof they needed was the hole itself. Because the presence of that perfectly carved window in your head, that was enough. You had been opened, you had been brave, you had endured. Your skull was now marked by ritual, by pain, and by possibility. In many societies, this turned into status. You weren't just a patient, you were someone who had survived a direct encounter with the spiritual world. A person with a visible scar that whispered, "This one crossed the line and came back." You weren't sick anymore, you were initiated. There are even cases of people being trepanned before symptoms appeared as a kind of metaphysical insurance. The idea was to stay open, stay accessible, let the light in and the darkness out, a preemptive spiritual chimney. If symptoms did return, well, they always had the tools. Some skulls show multiple openings, carved over time. Perhaps a relapse, perhaps just a cautious family hoping to stay ahead of whatever force they believed was lingering. Of course, not all outcomes were sunny. If you died, that was interpreted too. Maybe the spirit was too strong. Maybe the healer failed. Maybe it wasn't a demon. Maybe it was your fate. But no one blamed the hole. The hole had done its part. And then there were the truly unlucky. Those who kept acting strange, even after who continued seeing things, continued shouting, continued dreaming of snakes and storms. These people were no longer just patients. They became problems. In some communities, they were removed. In others, they were revered or feared as permanently altered. Part human, part portal. Healing, as always, was as much about the expectations of others as it was about your own health. But let's say it worked. Let's say you walked out with your skull healing and your neighbor smiling. Now you're different, blessed, marked, and somewhere, maybe in your pouch, maybe on a string round your neck, you're carrying the little piece they cut out. Because, in the ancient world, the cure didn't stop at the surgery. Sometimes, it traveled with you. It's a strange thing, digging through ancient graves and realizing how many skulls were opened like they had a story to tell. Some were messy, rushed, ragged at the edges. Others were neat as coins. And some, perhaps most chilling of all, looked perfectly executed, yet showed no signs of healing. No new bone, no regrowth, no survival. They were the unlucky. Or, depending on who was watching, the sacrificial. Some were trepanned during illness and simply didn't make it. Others were already dead. Post-mortem operations meant to free the soul, cleanse the body, or complete a ritual that couldn't be paused just because the patient stopped breathing. And some were, somewhere in between. People who were failing fast, and someone tried heroically or desperately to open the door just in time. It didn't always work, but the attempt itself was sacred. There are skulls where the cut was halfway finished, as if the healer realized, mid-procedure, that the spirit had already left, or that the body had. Some are marked by tentative scraping, shallow and cautious. Others are brutal, sharp, deep, decisive. Maybe time was short, maybe the belief was strong, Maybe the demon wasn't being polite. And yet, even among the dead, you see reverence. The head was still buried carefully. The hole was still respected, because whether or not you survived, the procedure meant something. It wasn't failure, it was an offering, a last attempt to restore order. But the survivors, oh, they were something else. You see it in the calcified rings around the opening, like tree bark, the body rebuilding itself. Skulls that were scraped open, healed, scraped again, healed again. Some people had 4 or 5 trepanations across a lifetime. That's not bad luck. That's ritual maintenance, like cosmic dentistry, but with more blood. They didn't just live, they lived long enough to be trepanned more than once. One skull from Peru had a giant rectangular hole, not just a circle, but a window, and the man lived long enough for the bone to grow smooth around the opening. He probably wore a wrap around his head. Or maybe he didn't. Maybe he walked into ceremonies with the wind brushing bone, because he was one of the lucky ones. He found a healer who knew what they were doing, or a spirit who decided to leave, or a culture that treated pain as a path, not a punishment. These survivors may have walked slower, may have seen differently, may have heard things no one else could, but they were living proof that trepanation wasn't madness. It was medicine, in their terms anyway. And if your skull still carried the scar decades later, you didn't hide it. You showed it off. Because some holes in the head didn't mean emptiness. They meant passage. And as we widen that passage, it's time to ask who received it, who was allowed, who was chosen, and whether there was any pattern at all. Because behind those holes were bodies, and behind those bodies, roles. After skull, after burial site. At first glance, it might look like trepanation was a man's ordeal, the price of war, of violence, of fighting one-to-many duels with pointy sticks and bad temper. And yes, many trepan skulls are male. Warriors, hunters, protectors, men who likely caught rocks to the head, fell off cliffs, or just ran into the wrong end of another man's spiritual crisis. In cultures where combat was sacred, healing the head wasn't just mercy, it was national security. Your best fighters couldn't afford to be touched by trauma, by demons, by the creeping fog of disorientation. So the hole was made, the balance was restored, the war could continue. But look closer, and you start to find women. Women with careful holes in the skull. Women buried with amulets and trepanned temples. Women who, by the looks of their remains, weren't warriors but witnesses to something heavy. Some of them young, some elderly, some right in the middle, at the height of fertility and ritual responsibility. So what happened? There's evidence that in many societies, women were trepanned for different reasons. Not combat, but madness, visions, grief, conditions we might today call depression, psychosis, postpartum disorder, epilepsy. In a world where a woman's behavior was tightly monitored, stepping outside the expected, a scream, a silence, a refusal was enough to raise the question, is she herself, or is something else inside her? And so, the blade was summoned. In some cases, the trepanation might have been connected to childbirth. The bleeding, the seizures, the fever that comes when something goes wrong. There are skulls of women who died young, bearing the signs of attempted intervention. A hole scraped into the temple as a last-ditch effort to pull them back from the brink. Was it medicine? Was it prayer? Probably both. The line didn't exist yet. In spiritual traditions where women were seers or spirit carriers, the trepanation might not have been punishment at all, but initiation. To make a woman into a vessel, you had to open her, and were better than the crown. Even children weren't exempt from this pattern. Trepanned girls buried in ceremonial positions. It wasn't just one culture, it was many. Sometimes, the statistics lean male, other times, they're evenly split. In some Andean graves, more women than men show signs of trepanation. So no, it wasn't just a masculine ordeal, it was a human one. A response to illness, to ecstasy, to loss of control. And while men may have filled the battlefield, women filled the homes, the temples, the birthing huts. And when something went wrong in any of those places, the solution was the same. Open the door. Whether to let something in, or let something out, was just a matter of perspective. And if that perspective shifted over time, if the knowledge faded, the hole remained. Next, let's ask how far this practice traveled through time. Not geographically, but chronologically. Because while it may sound like ancient history, some people never let go of the blade. You'd think something as invasive as drilling into someone's skull would have been left behind with bronze swords and goat-based weather forecasting, but trepanation, like most persistent bad ideas, see also, leeches, bloodletting, and wearing lead as makeup, refused to go quietly. It lingered, sometimes in ritual, sometimes in desperation, sometimes in dusty medical textbooks written by men who absolutely thought they knew what they were doing. Let's start with the Middle Ages, when Europe was deeply suspicious of anything pre-Christian, and yet somehow still scraping heads open. Trepanation was practiced to release evil vapors, to treat madness, to relieve headaches, and, occasionally, to correct unholy thoughts. It was half surgery, half exorcism, and rarely successful in either. By the Renaissance, it had taken on a new wardrobe: white robes, anatomy lectures, Latin. Trepanation was now considered scientific. Instruments got fancier: rotating bits, polished bone saws, spiral drills called trefines, but the goal stayed the same: open the skull, fix what lies beneath. Sometimes it worked. More often, it became the fastest way to turn a patient into a cadaver with a Latin eulogy. And then came the battlefields: Napoleonic Wars, American Civil War. Trepanation made a grisly comeback as soldiers took blows to the head and surgeons tried to relieve pressure with whatever was on hand. Survival rates were not great, but compared to doing nothing, slightly better, marginally, if you ignored the infection part. Even into the 19th century, trepanation showed up in frontier medicine. Folk doctors, military medics, and country healers scraping open skulls like it was still the Neolithic, only now with buttons and waistcoats. But here's where it gets even stranger. By the 1960s, a small and determined group of people, mostly in Europe and America, decided that trepanation wasn't just healing, it was liberation. Enter the era of consciousness expansion. Yes, in a time when LSD and free love were rewriting the rules of the mind, some believed the only way to truly transcend the ego was to open a physical window in the skull. There were manifestos, there were interviews, there were DIY trepanation kits. I wish I were joking. People sat in bathtubs with power drills, convinced that removing a coin-sized piece of bone would increase brain blood flow, enhance awareness, and unlock their full psychic potential. Spoiler alert, it didn't, but some survived. Some still swear by it. And if you go down the right YouTube rabbit hole, or, let's be honest, the wrong one, you'll find them. And in modern medicine, trepanation still technically exists, only now we call it a craniectomy or craniotomy, depending on what happens to the bone after. When the brain swells dangerously after injury, surgeons sometimes remove part of the skull to prevent death. It's a real, life-saving procedure, done with sterile tools, in bright, humming rooms. No incense, no demons, just pressure, blood, and high-stakes math. So no, it never truly died. It evolved. From sacred ritual to battlefield necessity to fringe spiritual movement to emergency surgery. The hole, it turns out, never really closed. And next, we return to the beginning. The skull, the bone, the boundary. The idea that your head was never entirely yours. That skull of yours, the one you probably think of as your private property, your one true container, your sacred and personal brain case, has never truly belonged to you. Not in the eyes of history. Not in the rituals, not when belief was stronger than bone. In the ancient world, the body wasn't a sealed system. It wasn't yours to protect or modify at will. It was a vessel, and vessels don't own themselves. They're used, carried, emptied, refilled. The skull, in particular, was viewed less like a personal asset and more like a communal threshold, a door, a wall, a conversation. And if that vessel became too full, with visions, spirits, madness, grief, someone else had the authority, even the duty, to open it. For your own good, of course, or for the good of the group, or the gods, or the crops. Your pain wasn't always private, it was often interpreted publicly. If you ranted, cried, failed to smile at the right time, if you trembled too much or dreamed too vividly, someone would notice, and someone would recommend a solution. You didn't ask for the blade, it was brought to you. Trepanation wasn't just about you. It was about us, your family, your tribe, your cosmology. Your head wasn't just malfunctioning, it was leaking disorder. And that couldn't be allowed to fester, so they made the cut. And when they were done, whether you lived or died, that hole was part of your public legacy. Sometimes, The bone disc was kept as an amulet. Sometimes it was buried with you. Sometimes it was worn by someone else, for protection, or remembrance, or power. Your skull was never silent. It was read, interpreted, whispers caught in bone, evidence of suffering and resilience, a map of what had gone wrong, and what had been done to fix it. In some cultures, trypan skulls were displayed, revered, sometimes even passed down, inherited, like a story, or a warning, or a talisman. These weren't medical records, they were ritual archives, proof that the body could be rewritten. And even now, thousands of years later, your skull might not be left alone. It might end up in a museum, labeled and lit, gawked at by schoolchildren, or scanned into databases, or used in studies, or featured in a TikTok reel on ancient medicine that will terrify you. A sacred relic, now a teaching aid, a ritual scar, now a clickbait thumbnail. Because no matter how personal you think your mind is, your skull has always had other agendas. Maybe that's the final lesson trepanation teaches us, that even the most intimate parts of ourselves, our thoughts, our fears, our pain, have never truly been ours alone. They've always been shared, with the ancestors, with the gods, with the knife. The body remembers, the bone speaks, and sometimes what it says is simple: they opened me, and I survived. It began, as so many medical miracles do, with a dead man on the riverbank and someone nearby who just couldn't take a hint. In 18th century London, where the air smelled faintly of coal smoke and moral panic, the River Thames was not only a waterway but a daily death sentence. People fell in, jumped in, were pushed in, or simply vanished beneath the opaque, slow-churning surface. Most didn't come back. Those who did were dragged ashore, limp, waterlogged, and unresponsive, at which point the real improvisation began. The idea was simple. If a person had drowned, it meant water had filled the lungs, cold had snuffed the inner flame, and the soul, assuming it hadn't already fled, needed to be persuaded back into place. Mouth-to-mouth wasn't quite in fashion yet. So, naturally, the next best solution was to take tobacco smoke, ideally warm, pungent, and thoroughly blessed by colonial trade routes, and blow it directly into the rectum. Not symbolically, not poetically, literally. This was not fringe thinking. This was endorsed. Public health officials stationed resuscitation kits along the Thames, full sets of tools designed to deliver a gust of life where the sun famously doesn't shine. The kit typically included a bellows, a brass nozzle, and a long rubber tube. Sometimes it was done manually, mouth-to-hose, if the situation demanded it. Because when you're standing over a corpse and trying to look helpful, dignity tends to take the day off, and it wasn't done in secret. People saw it. Boatmen, dock workers, even curious children probably paused mid-loaf to watch a gentleman in a waistcoat deliver divine tobacco wind to the hindquarters of a man who'd just eaten half the river. The reasoning was strange, but not random. Tobacco was hot, dry, and stimulating, the exact opposite of a cold, wet death. The rectum, for its part, was considered an excellent place to revive someone, porous, discreetly out of the way, and packed with enough blood vessels to carry the fire of life straight to the heart. It wasn't just about heat. It was about restoring animation, relighting the inner furnace, one puff at a time. There are records of people being revived this way, whether from drowning, choking, or simply passing out from shock. And because results, however anecdotal, were enough to validate just about anything in pre-antibiotic medicine, the practice stuck. By the mid-1700s, the Royal Humane Society, yes, a real and very serious institution, distributed tobacco resuscitation kits throughout London, encouraging anyone near water to be ready to insert and inflate at a moment's notice. Posters explained the technique. Medical journals described it with straight-faced enthusiasm. No one seemed especially concerned about modesty. Death, after all, had no sense of decorum. But once the air was in, once the bellows were quiet, and the limp form gave a twitch, then came the questions. Did it really work? Or did the embarrassment alone shock the drowned back into consciousness? And more importantly, if smoke could revive the dead, what else might it cure? Because while the river gave this method its moment, it was sadness, melancholy, and despair that would give it staying power. For centuries, the mouth had been romanticized as the seat of breath and speech. the place where life entered and meaning left. But in the medical minds of Enlightenment Europe, ever hungry for novelty and oddly fixated on orifices, a new idea took hold. The rectum was the real back door to vitality. This wasn't satire. It was science. Or at least, the version of science that existed before microscopes outnumbered ghosts. Anatomists noted that the lower gut had blood vessels, plenty of them, and they were close to the surface. Things absorbed quickly down there. Liquids, gases, powders. If you could get the right substance inside, you could reach the bloodstream faster than by swallowing. The rectum, in other words, was efficient, and tobacco was miraculous. At least according to the colonial logic of the time, the kind that turned sacred indigenous plants into global cure-alls by way of plantation and pipe. It was hot, dry, penetrating. It stimulated the nerves. It cleared the lungs. It revivified the spirit. It also made people slightly dizzy and very chatty, which, to 18th century physicians, was practically a recovery. So the theory went like this: if someone was unconscious, if they were cold, drowned, melancholic, or simply refusing to wake up, you could introduce tobacco smoke through the rectum, and the warmth and stimulation would spread inward, like lighting a fire under the soul. It was never about digestion. It was about animation. Tobacco was breath made visible. Smoke was spirit with edges. This led to devices of increasing specificity. Bellows with long, curved nozzles, silver tubes for the more refined patients, portable insufflation kits for physicians on the go, instructional diagrams, medical society demonstrations, polite illustrations of a fully dressed gentleman crouching behind a mostly naked patient in clinical pursuit of salvation. And while tobacco enemas were often used on the recently drowned, their reach extended fast. Fainting women, listless children, men of letters suffering from nervous collapse. The treatment made its way into boudoirs and asylum wings. Some healers claimed it could ease cramps, cure constipation, dispel bad humors, and lighten the shadow of grief. The rectum wasn't just a site of rescue. It became a gateway, a portal to internal landscapes too delicate for crude methods like bleeding or vomiting. When the mouth lied, the bowels told the truth. By the late 1700s, the technique had become so common that public rescue stations included signs encouraging passers-by to apply it immediately. No need to wait for a physician. After all, anyone with a strong arm and access to a pipe could be a hero. And tobacco, ever the enthusiastic protagonist in European medicine, was more than willing to be the sacrament, blown, burned, and blessed until one started to wonder where, exactly, this sacred leaf had come from, and how it was used before Europeans got their hands on it. Because long before bellows and brass tubes, smoke had already found its way into darker, deeper places. Long before Enlightenment physicians began aiming bellows at buttocks with unearned confidence, tobacco had another life, one far stranger, and far less clinical. It was never meant to be medicine in the way a tincture is medicine. In its homeland across the Americas, from the forests of Brazil to the mesas of the Southwest, tobacco wasn't something you smoked to unwind. It was something you offered, something you feared, something that, when used properly, could open the veil between worlds, and when misused, could fry your soul like a bad harvest. Among many indigenous cultures, tobacco was a ritual plant, sacred not for its flavor or kick, but for its proximity to the divine. It was burned to communicate with spirits, blown across the skin to ward off illness, smoked, or more interestingly, administered rectally, to purge deeper, to travel, to suffer, and to see. The rectal application wasn't invented in Enlightenment London. It was borrowed, or more accurately, flattened. In parts of Amazonia, healers used tobacco enemas during powerful shamanic ceremonies to induce visions and cleanse spiritual impurities. These were not casual treatments. They were initiations. The smoke wasn't to stimulate the nerves. It was to unbind the self. If the gods came, it was through the pain. Of course, this didn't survive the translation. When European explorers saw smoke being blown into the anus, they didn't see theology. They saw opportunity. Here was a plant that was spiritually potent, pharmacologically active, and just unpleasant enough to be taken seriously. With a little rebranding, it could be a universal cure. And so, tobacco, once a sacred botanical presence, tied to myth and fire and breath, was stripped of its context and packaged for export. Colonial trade routes lit up. Planters in Virginia and the Caribbean filled ships with leaf. European scientists stuffed it into pipes, sachets, and eventually into bellows. The spiritual meaning, forgotten. The ritual danger, irrelevant. All that mattered was that it could wake a man from unconsciousness and make a woman stop fainting long enough to attend supper. The enema was no longer an initiation. It was healthcare. Ironically, as tobacco became global, it also became mundane. Something to sniff, to chew, to smoke at breakfast. The sacred plant that once carried prayers now lined the pockets of aristocrats and the throats of chimney boys. Its roots in indigenous cosmology were obscured by soot, medical pamphlets, and plantation profit. Still, traces remained, in how doctors spoke of it with reverence, with awe, with vague unease, in how patients submitted, not quite understanding why it worked, only that it must, and in how it was administered, not by accident, but by ritual, however medicalized. By the time it reached its peak, the tobacco smoke enema had become a standardized, respectable procedure, complete with equipment, instructions, and the unquestioned logic of empire. But no amount of brass fittings and powdered wigs could distract from the tools themselves. Because while the theory changed, the equipment stayed weird. Medicine has always had a flair for absurd props. Leech jars, bloodletting basins, tongue scrapers made of ivory. But few instruments inspire the same uncomfortable blend of curiosity and second-hand embarrassment as the tobacco enema kit. It was a real thing, manufactured, distributed, endorsed. And it looked exactly as awkward as you're imagining. The standard kit included 4 essentials: a bellows, to generate airflow, a flexible tube, usually rubber or leather, a brass nozzle, for insertion, and a burning dish, in which tobacco was lit and smoldered, just long enough to push its acrid soul into the waiting lungs of a semi-conscious body. Some versions were more refined, others were grotesquely homemade. All of them required proximity, coordination, and the willingness to kneel behind someone in crisis with a straight face. It wasn't always the doctor who administered the smoke. That's the uncomfortable part. In riverside emergencies, it might be a passing fisherman, a well-meaning stranger, a child with strong lungs and no understanding of shame. The Royal Humane Society, again, a very real and reputable organization, encouraged anyone to take action if they found a body near water. Insert the tube, blow steadily, wait for signs of revival, in that order. Some kits were installed in public spaces, like fire extinguishers, hanging innocently beside bridges and docks, break glass in case of near death. Others were kept in personal homes, just in case Aunt Margaret fainted again during tea. Instructions were printed on pamphlets. Engravings showed the process in tasteful detail. The stiff figures, the open trousers, the smoke rising like incense from a human candlestick. The person receiving the treatment, of course, was often unconscious, or at least pretending to be, which seems like a rational response. But when they weren't, one imagines the scenario with sympathy. You wake up cold and wet, gasping for air, and discover a stranger crouched behind you with a lit pipe and a look of medical enthusiasm. It's hard to know who the real victim is at that point, but the practice persisted, because the tools made it feel real, made it feel scientific. There's something about brass and smoke that lends credibility to even the most ludicrous procedure. Add in a white coat, a Latin phrase or two, and a deeply uncomfortable patient, and you've got 18th century innovation at its peak. And while this kit was first marketed for drowning, it quickly found new uses: fatigue, melancholy, hysteria, even heartbreak. All it took was a little repackaging, a little optimism, and the belief that perhaps what the body needed wasn't gentleness or time, but hot, blessed air delivered from behind. Because if blowing smoke could resurrect the drowned, maybe it could also soothe the sad. Once the rectal bellows had proven their worth against the river, dragging half-drowned souls back from the edge with nothing but fire, faith, and questionable aim, it was only a matter of time before someone wondered, what if sadness is just a kind of slow drowning? Medicine in the 18th century was obsessed with stimulation, not in the modern, caffeinated sense, but in the deeper, stranger idea that the body was a series of slumbering systems that needed jolting awake. You weren't sick, necessarily. You were stagnant, too cold, still, too moist. And tobacco, that fiery ambassador from the New World, was the perfect antagonist for melancholy. So began the soft descent from resuscitation to emotion management. Patients described as sluggish, listless, or overcome with nervous affliction were increasingly treated not with words, nor leeches, but with smoke delivered directly into the large intestine, that most humble of emotional regulators, hysteria, depression, ennui, general spiritual fatigue, all were fair game. The logic wasn't as deranged as it sounds. The gut had already been tied to mood. The bowels were where bile brewed, where humors festered. If your inner winds were misaligned, of course your heart would ache. Tobacco smoke, blown with just the right amount of reverence and pressure, was said to clear blockages, dry excess phlegm, awaken the vital spirits, and most importantly, restore that elusive lightness of being. There's something both ridiculous and oddly poetic about it. Picture it, a woman pacing in grief over a lost child. A man slumped in his chair, staring into nothing, unable to weep or scream. Enter the physician, tools in tow, solemn as a priest, and his remedy is not counsel, nor companionship, but smoke funneled into the very place decorum avoids, because somewhere between despair and digestion, the soul might still be reachable. The treatment didn't just aim to jolt the body, it was meant to inspire movement of breath, of tears, of emotions lodged too deeply to speak. In some cases, it worked, or at least, patients claimed it did, perhaps because discomfort is easy to confuse with healing, or perhaps because, when life had drained all meaning from the world, even indignity could feel like a form of touch. There were testimonies, journals, physicians describing the successful revival of a melancholic patient through gentle insufflation and the encouragement of natural motion. The smoke, they believed, traveled inward and upward, waking nerves, loosening sorrows, coaxing the soul from wherever it had gone, sulking. And of course, there was always the placebo effect. Few things say someone cares like a stranger lighting tobacco for your colon in a desperate attempt to rekindle your will to live. Still, even the most enthusiastic practitioners couldn't quite explain why it worked, only that it did. Sometimes, when the sadness wasn't too old, when the patient still had a little fire left, but not everyone bought the emotional explanation. Others returned to the old medical roots, to humors, to balance, to stimulating the system itself, with theories more anatomical than poetic. And so the enema met its next justification, this time dressed in diagrams and Latin, for something that involved puffing smoke into a stranger's rectum with the seriousness of a last rite. The tobacco enema had surprisingly enthusiastic defenders in scientific circles, and by scientific, of course, we mean pre-germa theory gentlemen with powdered wigs and a tendency to name bodily fluids after the weather. The reasoning, such as it was, rested on the grand old scaffolding of humoral theory, that elegant, if wildly inaccurate, idea that human health was a matter of balancing internal fluids, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Get them wrong, and you'd become melancholic, choleric, or simply inconvenient. Get them right, and you were a paragon of virtue and good digestion. In this worldview, the rectum wasn't just a waste chute, it was a portal, a vulnerable site of exchange, a place where the wrong winds could accumulate and the right ones could be introduced. And tobacco, with its hot, dry, pungent temperament, was the ideal counteragent to all things damp, cold, and depressive. Doctors insisted that blowing smoke into the colon wasn't random. It was a targeted strike against phlegmatic lethargy and intestinal stagnation. It stimulated peristalsis, the muscular contractions of the gut. It increased circulation. It warmed the liver. It cleared obstructions of the viscera. It encouraged the return of the pulse. One 1780s physician even argued it could reverse death itself, provided the application was firm, continuous, and with great sincerity. And because Enlightenment medicine was halfway between alchemy and showmanship, they made charts, elaborate, ink-drenched illustrations of the human digestive system, complete with arrows indicating the journey of sacred smoke, from nozzle, from rectum to intestines, from intestines to liver, lungs, heart, brain, until the entire person was deemed reanimated and possibly slightly high. They also leaned heavily on absorption theory. The rectum was full of blood vessels. After all, substances administered there acted faster, more directly. It was a delivery route with fewer detours. The same principle that would one day lead to suppositories was now being used to justify blowing fireleaf into the backsides of people who hadn't asked for it. And it wasn't just theory. They measured outcomes, crudely, yes, but enthusiastically. Heart rates, reflexes, skin color. Did the patient twitch? Did their eyes flutter? Did they fart? All were signs of success, or at least, of something happening, which in that era was often enough to call it science. The real miracle, though, was not the smoke or the bellows, but the conviction, the unwavering belief that they understood what they were doing, that the body was a machine of flammable sadness, and that if you just applied enough pressure, literally, it might restart. And so, for a brief and awkward century, the act of blowing tobacco into a stranger's colon became not only accepted, but recommended, taught, illustrated, praised, until, of course, someone lit the wrong pipe, and everything exploded. Yes, literally. If medicine has one consistent theme across centuries, it's this: well-intentioned disasters. The tobacco smoke enema was no exception. For all its brass fittings and Baroque justifications, it was still fire and lungs, and flammable gas in extremely close proximity, a recipe so inherently risky, it could only have thrived before the invention of liability lawyers. The most infamous case, whispered in medical footnotes like a ghost story for students, involves a well-meaning practitioner, a drowned patient, a poorly vented pipe, and one tragically timed spark. Tobacco smoke wasn't generated magically, after all. It required fire, often an open flame, and when the bellows were squeezed just a little too forcefully, they didn't just send smoke into the rectum, they sent it through the intestines, mixing with the natural gases of decay and digestion until, yes, a minor internal explosion occurred. It's unclear if the patient ever revived, but one imagines they certainly left an impression. And that was just the worst-case scenario. More common were the humiliations. Assistants accidentally inserted the nozzle backward, or blew smoke into already bloated bellies, until patients groaned like haunted cupboards. There were tales of burns, bruises, tears, and confusion, particularly when the patient was still semi-conscious and unsure whether this was medicine or some obscure moral punishment. Then there were the reputational injuries. Doctors caught mid-insufflation by disapproving relatives. Clergymen who endorsed the practice until parishioners began asking awkward, theological questions about why salvation now required access to their back end. Even the Royal Humane Society, once an eager promoter, began to step back politely. And then, with increasing haste, as public taste changed and the jokes started writing themselves, satirists had a field day. Pamphlets emerged with names like the Air of Recovery and A Puff for Your Pain. Cartoonists drew exaggerated bellows, grotesque poses, and horrified patients, clenching tight against unwanted miracles. The tobacco enema, once a symbol of rational, modern healing, had become a punchline in powdered form. But the most damning cautionary tale wasn't fire or laughter. It was failure. The slow realization that for all its ceremony and conviction, the treatment didn't always work, that people still died, that sadness remained, that the miracle was more in the ritual than the result. And once that seed of doubt was planted, the whole house of bellows and smoke began to wobble. Because as new sciences emerged, bacteriology, anesthetics, neurology, the idea that blowing smoke anywhere could solve a medical crisis began to sound less like innovation and more like desperation. Yet, even in retreat, the legacy lingered, quietly, strangely, like the faint smell of old tobacco clinging to a room long after the fire's gone out. No great medical tradition ends with fanfare. It slips away slowly, one textbook revision at a time, one awkward silence in the lecture hall, until the thing once hailed as salvation becomes the thing no one mentions at dinner. That's exactly what happened to the tobacco smoke enema. It didn't get outlawed, it got outgrown. As the 19th century crept in with its microscopes and sterile gloves, the winds shifted, pun, regrettably, intended. Germ theory arrived like a disapproving chaperone, making it much harder to justify blowing burnt plant matter into mucous membranes with unwashed bellows. Suddenly, disease had causes that couldn't be soothed with warmth or whimsy. They required antiseptics, charts, precision, and a little dignity, and so the kits were put away. The pamphlets stopped printing. The public bellows stations near rivers quietly vanished, replaced, in some places, by life rings and emergency blankets. A few stubborn physicians clung to the practice, like aging musicians insisting the harpsichord would make a comeback. But most understood the message. Rectal insufflation was no longer fashionable. Ironically though, the rectum itself never left the conversation. Once physicians accepted that the lower bowel was indeed a site of fast absorption, they didn't abandon it, they just refined their methods. Enter suppositories, retention enemas, rectal thermometers, and even Bertheleved anesthesia, all the fun of colon-based intervention, with less smoke and fewer explosions. The delivery of medicine through the rectum became clinical, sanitized, hidden behind curtains and stainless steel. And the more it worked, the less anyone felt the need to mention its slightly embarrassing ancestor, the one involving a pipe, a prayer, and a very confused patient. Still, the old logic was there. When the stomach couldn't handle it, or the veins were too collapsed, or the patient was too far gone to swallow, the rectum was called in as the unsung hero of emergency care. Fast, discreet, reliable, and this time, less flammable. You could say that tobacco enema walked so the modern suppository could run, or at least waddle briskly in the right direction. And in a strange twist of fate, the practice that once symbolized the most outlandish optimism of Enlightenment medicine now survives in fragments, not as ritual, but as practicality. There are still lessons to be learned here, about how quickly a miracle becomes a myth, about how cultural borrowing turns into clinical routine, and about how, sometimes, the things we laugh at were once taken seriously enough to be someone's last hope. But the story doesn't end with modern hospitals, because somewhere else in the world, far from brass tubes and powdered wigs, the practice of smoke and spirit never stopped, while the West quietly buried its bellows in museum drawers and let the whole affair fade into punchline territory. Other parts of the world never saw it as ridiculous, because for many indigenous cultures, particularly in South and Central America, tobacco was never a quirky stimulant or a pipeside pastime. It was, and still is, sacred. Not metaphorically sacred, literally, as in, this plant speaks. It burns with purpose. It opens doors. Among various Amazonian peoples, for example, tobacco remains a central tool in the spiritual toolkit used not to calm nerves, but to cleanse, to connect, and to protect. And yes, sometimes, it's still administered rectally, but not for resuscitation or melancholy, for initiation, for medicine in its original, terrifying, beautiful form. The kind that has nothing to do with hospitals and everything to do with spirit. Take the Matses, people of Peru and Brazil. Their rituals include blowing potent tobacco mixtures into each other's noses, and when deeper cleansing is required, directly into the rectum. This isn't done with bellows and brass. It's done with care, with knowledge, with the understanding that the body isn't just flesh, but a vessel of memory, trauma, and inherited imbalance. The smoke isn't just seen as heat or stimulant. It's a force. A spirit that enters the body, scrapes off what doesn't belong, and drags it out, violently, if necessary. Participants often vomit, shake, cry, not because something's gone wrong, but because that's what real healing looks like when it's working. In these ceremonies, tobacco is not alone. It's part of a wider cosmology, one that includes plant teachers, ancestral voices, and the belief that illness doesn't start in the stomach or brain, but in disconnection, from others, from the land, from self. And when you're that far gone, healing doesn't come in capsules or kind words. It comes in smoke, in openings, in rituals that reach places the conscious mind cannot. In this context, the rectal route isn't strange, it's practical. The gut is where poison hides, where fear festers. If you want to purge a nightmare, you don't chant affirmations. You flush the shadows out with fire. So while European doctors forgot their smoke-blowing past with a nervous cough and a redirect, these indigenous traditions carried on, not because they resisted modernity, but because they never confused tools with truth. They knew something the West had forgotten, that the body isn't just a system to be managed, it's a terrain, a battlefield, a temple, and sometimes, the only way to clean it is to send smoke straight to the place where secrets hide. And just when you think this story has found its resting place in forest ritual and colonial embarrassment, well, it finds a new life. Because, as it turns out, modern biohackers couldn't resist the old flame either. It was only a matter of time, really. Somewhere between oat milk enemas and nootropic nasal sprays, the tech optimists of the modern age stumbled upon history's most awkward forgotten cure and said, what if we brought it back, but with better branding? Enter the biohacker, that sleek, restless creature of cold plunges and quantified selves, forever cycling through ancient rituals and calling them protocols. For them, nothing is sacred and everything is potentially therapeutic. Fasting is metabolic reprogramming, chanting is sonic alignment, and then, the colon is prime real estate for optimization. To be fair, they didn't start with smoke. That would have been too analog. They began with coffee enemas, beloved by certain alternative health circles for decades, now repackaged with frosted glass kits and minimalist fonts. Then came ozone insufflation, herbal infusions, and eventually, almost inevitably, the return of rectally administered tobacco extracts, purified, measured, and, of course, ethically sourced. No bellows this time, no brass or awkward crouching, just syringes, sleek tubing, maybe a diffuser if you're fancy. Administered solo, in curated bathrooms with dim lighting and smart speakers humming lo-fi beats. Because nothing says spiritual cleansing like a Spotify playlist titled Gamma Wave Zen. The rationale, not so different from 1790. Stimulation of the vagus nerve, parasympathetic activation, gut-brain recalibration, but now it's sprinkled with terms like mitochondrial enhancement and dopamine detox. The soul may have left the room, but the spreadsheet has arrived. You'll find testimonials, of course, glowing reviews on forums. I felt reborn. My anxiety vanished. I saw colors I can't describe. Some claim it cured their IBs. Others swear by the clarity it brings. A few, more honest, simply admit, I did it for the story. And let's not pretend this is mainstream. Even among the crystal-eating, raw-liver-consuming elite, tobacco rectal therapy remains a fringe pursuit. But its presence, its eerie, smoke-tinged return, says something about us, about how quickly shame turns into curiosity, how the weird becomes the wellness trend, and how the line between medicine and madness is often just a matter of presentation. Copper bellows in a satchel, or a white-label syringe on your wellness shelf. In the end, the practice didn't die, it mutated. From resuscitation to ritual, from colon to content. What was once a desperate riverbank remedy is now a hacked, bougie experience promoted on Instagram by someone named Ether, who lives in a yacht and sells colon care NFTs. Full circle, in a way. Only now the gods aren't spirits or science, they're algorithms, and the sacred wind, still blowing, just with better packaging. It always starts with balance, not kindness, not hygiene, just balance, that awkward, elusive middle ground between too much and too little, between bile and blood, between fire and phlegm. Ancient medicine wasn't aiming for comfort, it was aiming for cosmic symmetry, and sometimes the only way to restore that symmetry was with poison. In the medical texts of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Greece, healing looked a lot like harm. Bitter herbs, blistering oils, metals that shimmered like water but burned like flame. These weren't last resorts, they were often first choices. The logic was simple. If illness was a foreign invasion, then something stronger, meaner, and more unnatural had to chase it out. Mercury, for instance, wasn't just admired for its liquid beauty, it was revered for its motion, always shifting, never settling, like a spirit refusing to be trapped. To ancient minds, that meant it could stir stagnant forces inside the body, dislodge the heavy humors that bred melancholy or madness, the same way you'd shake a dirty bottle to mix the sediment, except in this case, the bottle was your spleen. And arsenic, that fine white powder found in volcanic rock and imperial kitchens alike. It had range. In Persian pharmacology, it was recorded as both a healer and a weapon. A pinch could clear skin. 2 pinches could end a dynasty. That duality, that lethal tenderness, was precisely what gave it power. A substance that could kill was a substance that knew where the soul hid. It could reach it, scrape it, clean, and retreat. Feces, though that was different, less elegant, less poetic, but far older. In Egyptian medicine, crocodile dung was mashed into pastes. In Roman texts, human feces were dried and powdered for wound care and snakebite. And in traditional Chinese medicine, fermented infant feces, called yellow soup, was used to treat severe diarrhea and fevers in children. The assumption wasn't that filth was evil, it was that filth, used wisely, could fight evil. Like training a dog to hunt wolves, dirty, but effective. None of this was symbolic, not really. It wasn't metaphorical or spiritual fluff, layered onto ritual. These people were trying, sincerely, to get better, to live longer, to push through whatever mysterious force had curled itself around their stomach, or lungs, or mind. and they were willing to drink the unspeakable if that meant regaining clarity, or breath, or peace, because the body wasn't sacred. It was messy, porous, constantly leaking and absorbing, and anything that entered it, whether it glittered like stars or stank like sewage, had the potential to recalibrate what had gone wrong. And if the balance didn't return, well, maybe the soul would. Next time, there's something deeply human about looking at a glowing, poisonous liquid and thinking, yes, this will help me live forever. Ancient China perfected that urge. Mercury, particularly in its mineral form as cinnabar, the brilliant red ore of mercury sulfide, wasn't just beautiful, it was divine. It shimmered like blood, sparkled like firelight, and refused to behave like any other substance in the room. Naturally, someone decided it had to be immortal. In Taoist internal alchemy, the body wasn't a prison, it was a furnace, a delicate little crucible where breath, essence, and spirit could be refined into something more permanent, a subtle, luminous substance that would escape death, like smoke curling from an incense stick. But to fuel that transformation, they needed ingredients with cosmic properties. Cinnabar was ideal. It came from deep in the earth, carried the sheen of stars, and had the audacity to kill most things it touched. What better candidate for transcendence? So, they ground it, mixed it with honey or wine, and shaped it into pills, elixirs of longevity, sometimes called golden liquid jade. These were not taken lightly. They were often reserved for emperors, monks, or those attempting big spiritual leaps. And at first, it worked. Skin cleared, dreams intensified, the pulse steadied, the illusion of vitality wrapped itself around the body like a silk robe. Then came the tremors, the peeling gums, the bleeding, the darkening of the tongue. By the time the hallucinations began, visions of celestial beings, flaming chariots, and deathless mountains, it was hard to tell whether the patient was ascending or simply dying in style. But that didn't stop anyone. Temp's dynasty records are filled with nobles who, upon showing early symptoms of mercury poisoning, simply doubled down. The logic was circular and cruel. If the medicine made you suffer, that meant it was working. The body was being tested. The spirit was being refined. And if you vomited silver or passed crimson foam, it wasn't a medical emergency. It was metaphysical progress. And then there were those who didn't take mercury for themselves, but gave it to others. Taoist manuals often warned, if you were going to ingest mercury, you needed to purify yourself first, abstain from sex, cut ties with worldly desires, fast for days. Otherwise, the elixir wouldn't grant you eternal life. It would punish your arrogance with madness. That caveat didn't stop charlatans from selling it to anyone with enough coin and a strong stomach. Most of them didn't get to regret it. Still, the graves remain. Tombs of emperors lined with mercury pools, burial chambers infused with vapor, a final poisonous echo of the idea that death could be outwitted, not by avoiding danger, but by swallowing it whole. And if mercury didn't quite carry them to heaven, well, arsenic was always waiting with open arms. Arsenic never cared for theatrics. It didn't glow. It didn't move like liquid silver or sparkle in temple light. It was pale, chalky, often odorless, the quietest of poisons, which made it ideal, of course, for both murder and medicine, and for the strange breed of men who believed that ingesting it, gradually, prayerfully, and in increasing doses, could make them invincible. In parts of India and Persia, scattered accounts speak of poison eaters, not assassins, not magicians, but ascetics, men who lived outside society, chewed slowly on bitter leaves, and consumed arsenic in small, deliberate pinches. The idea wasn't to die. It was to build up tolerance, not metaphorical resistance, but biological immunity, to become untouchable, immune to poison in body and, by extension, in soul. They weren't widespread, they weren't mainstream, but they were noticed. By travelers, by colonial officers, by suspicious physicians. Some saw them as con artists, others as living proof that discipline could override death. The practice became mythic, a whisper passed between courts and caravanserais. There are men who cannot be killed by poison, men who have fed on arsenic for years and whose bodies are now more mineral than meat. But this wasn't just a spiritual stunt, it had a cruel practicality. In royal courts riddled with intrigue, where the wine might be laced, or the curry ever so slightly off, being immune to poison was a political advantage. And if you couldn't afford a food taster, becoming the taster might have been the next best thing. Still, The line between power and punishment was thin. Chronic arsenic exposure, even in microdoses, turns the skin waxy, gives breath a garlicky stench, weakens the heart, and blackens the fingertips. The transformation wasn't just internal. It showed. You could spot a poison eater by his dry lips, his brittle nails, his peculiar, inward gaze, somewhere between trance and resignation. And yet some claimed health benefits. A few European mountain communities, particularly in 19th century Austria, took arsenic recreationally. They believed it improved breathing, boosted strength, and gave the skin a luminous pallor. Women seeking fashionable paleness would dissolve arsenic in vinegar and take it like tonic. Romantic death, bottled. But the ascetics weren't chasing beauty, they were chasing detachment. They didn't care for vanity or courtly survival. They wanted to burn the ego from the inside out. Arsenic for them was a slow, bitter path to transcendence, not through gentleness, but through controlled destruction. The flesh would suffer, the body would decay, but the soul might remain, harder, leaner, less afraid. Of course, that path came with its own scent, and not everyone could stomach it. Which brings us, inevitably, to something even older, something more intimate, less shiny than arsenic, and far more plentiful. There's a certain honesty in filth. Other substances might try to dazzle, shimmer like gold, sting like frost, but feces makes no such attempt. It is what it is, which makes it all the more striking that for centuries, across empires and dynasties, healers kept reaching for it. Dry it, ferment it, mix it with wine. Whatever the method, the message was clear: waste heals. Start with the Egyptians. Among the spells and poultices in the Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest surviving medical texts, you'll find recipes calling for donkey dung, lizard blood, and moldy bread, sometimes all together. It wasn't superstition. It was an early understanding, however crude, of fermentation and microbial life. Rot, after all, could sometimes fight rot. A body invaded by unseen forces needed its own invisible counterattack. The Romans weren't shy either. Pliny the Elder, encyclopedic and eternally unbothered, catalogued the medicinal uses of goat droppings, pig, manure, and even human waste, powdered, diluted, swallowed, or applied to the skin. These remedies were suggested for everything from fevers to infections to epilepsy. Roman soldiers dried animal dung in their kits, just in case a wound turned foul, and the foul needed fighting with something fouler. In ancient China, the approach was less theatrical, more methodical. The Han dynasty gave us yellow soup, a treatment for severe gastrointestinal illnesses made from the fermented feces of healthy infants. Yes, infants. Their purity, both symbolic and microbial, was prized. The stool was dissolved in water, strained, and fed to those suffering from food poisoning or deadly diarrhea. It sounds grotesque, and yet it worked. The modern medical community, 2,000 years later, now calls it fecal microbiota transplantation. What these civilizations shared wasn't a love of filth. It was a recognition that life doesn't end at waste. The gut, teeming with invisible organisms, held the keys to both death and recovery. If poison could be medicine, then so could excrement, the body's own leftover alchemy, expelled but not useless. Even spiritually, feces held strange status. In some traditions, touching waste was taboo. In others, it was part of ritual purification, a way to confront impurity head-on, to strip away illusion. There were monks who rubbed ashes and filth on their skin as penance, midwives who used cow dung to ward off evil spirits, and physicians who administered enemas of boiled feces with more reverence than today's surgeons show their scalpels. And yes, the results varied. Some patients improved, others likely died with the taste still on their tongues. But the logic remained that health wasn't always found in fresh herbs or sacred springs. Sometimes it had to be dug from the opposite end of the spectrum. But where excrement offered microbial mystery, Tibet went even deeper, beyond the biological, into the symbolic. To outsiders, it always looks like madness. The horns, the drums, the skulls full of blood or barley, and somewhere in the center of it all, a pile of ritual dung, burning or frozen, but never just discarded. In Tibetan spiritual practice, waste doesn't go away, it transforms, and that includes excrement, not just tolerated, but occasionally revered. The line between medicine and mysticism has always been thin in the high plateaus of Tibet. Survival there requires creativity. At altitudes where nothing rots and little grows, the body becomes both laboratory and shrine. And in that ecology, feces isn't trash, it's fuel, it's warmth, it's offering. Dried yak dung, for instance, serves as kindling in monasteries and households alike, not out of desperation, but out of deep familiarity. It is gathered with care, stacked in domes, dried in the sun, but beyond its practical use, it plays a role in certain rituals of purification, especially those performed during New Year festivals or when warding off illness. A small quantity is burned, along with butter, grains, and hair, a smoky tribute to the forces that govern decay and rebirth. Then there's the darker, more esoteric layer. In certain tantric practices, particularly within Day, a tradition that focuses on ego dissolution through radical visualization, practitioners are taught to imagine offering up their own body as food to demons. Symbolically, this includes imagining one's own excrement as part of the sacred feast. It's not about degradation, it's about letting go of pride, offering every part of the self, even the parts most denied, most despised. Filth becomes a form of sacrifice, a surrender of ego, of illusion, of the idea that we are anything more than fleeting arrangements of matter. To offer excrement is to say, I have nothing left to hide. Even this, too, is part of the cosmos. And while most Tibetan medical texts don't prescribe feces as enthusiastically as their Chinese or Egyptian counterparts, there are scattered references to its use in plague medicine and certain emergency situations, mixed with herbs, boiled, filtered, taken, not as punishment, but as medicine, sacred because it's shocking, effective because it confronts what others fear. It's difficult to stomach, literally and culturally. But in Tibetan cosmology, impurity is just another form of ignorance. Once understood, it becomes neutral, and once offered, it becomes sacred. Of course, Western visitors often missed this entirely. To them, the smell was overpowering, the logic indecipherable. They wrote it off as superstition or madness, but they were missing the point. Because back in their own countries, something even stranger was happening, something gilded, something European, where powdered feces was considered crude, but gold-plated mercury pills were swallowed with a smile. No one poisons themselves quite like the upper class. In Renaissance and Enlightenment Europe, the wealthier you were, the more likely you were to swallow something truly outrageous, and the more poetic the excuse. Pale skin wasn't a symptom, it was fashion. Shaking hands, a sign of intellect. Bleeding gums, surely a small price for immortality, or at least, for avoiding wrinkles. Start with arsenic. In 18th and 19th century Austria and Italy, it was consumed not as punishment, but as beauty routine. Mixed with vinegar or rolled into little white wafers, arsenic was sold in markets as a complexion tonic. It cleared the skin, sharpened the eyes, and helped women achieve that delicate, deathly pallor so prized in polite society. A good poisoning made you look slightly ghost-like, and what, after all, is more aristocratic than appearing partially dead at dinner? Meanwhile, mercury took up residence in the veins of the sick and the stylish alike. If you had syphilis, and many of them did, mercury was your fate. It was rubbed into the gums, injected, vaporized in steam baths, even inserted rectally. A night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury, the doctors joked. But it wasn't just medical. Some court physicians administered mercury-based pills as digestive aids or vitality boosters. After all, if the French king was taking it, surely you should too. Even Queen Elizabeth I wasn't spared. That iconic pale face, not just a cosmetic choice, her signature white paint, Venetian cerus, was made with white lead, often mixed with mercury salts. Over time, it caused the skin to blister and decay. The solution: more paint, more poison. Repeat until fashionable death. And then there were the mercury purgatives, pills sold across apothecaries in London and Paris with names like Blue Mass or Calomel. They were marketed as cleansing agents, meant to purge the bowels, the bile, the melancholia. People took them daily. Children took them. Pregnant women took them. Lewis and Clark brought a trunk of mercury pills on their famous expedition, which is how archaeologists can still trace their campsites by testing for mercury in the soil. None of this was done in ignorance. They knew, at least vaguely, that these substances were toxic. But poison, in small enough doses, was thought to strengthen the constitution. It purified, it invigorated, it reminded the body who was in charge. And it wasn't just vanity or medicine. it was class performance. Only the elite could afford such fine poisons. Only they could suffer so to die slowly of mercury was to announce that you were important enough to be worth curing. Of course, not everyone wanted the slow route. Some wanted revelation, a deeper transformation, something that didn't just burn the gut or bleach the skin, but cracked open the inner world. So they turned, in desperation or devotion, to alchemy. Alchemy gets a bad reputation, thanks to all the lead-into-gold cliches and the occasional exploding monk. But at its core, it was never really about wealth. Not for the serious ones. It was about transformation, not just of metals, but of the soul. And to do that, you had to burn, you had to dissolve, you had to rot. Enlightenment, after all, doesn't come from sipping tea in a robe. It comes from ingesting things that try to kill you, and surviving anyway. In the Arab world, the alchemists were scholars, often physicians. They distilled arsenic, mercury, and sulfur with a kind of reverence. These weren't just substances, they were principles, elemental forces. Sulfur was the soul, quick to burn. Mercury was the spirit, slippery and changeable. Salt was the body, the thing that held form. To manipulate them was to perform a kind of sacred surgery, to pull apart reality and rebuild it from the bones up. In China, the Taoist alchemists had their own vision. As early as the 4th century, they were melting cinnabar into pills, believing that ingesting it would help the spirit ascend to the realm of the immortals. They wrote long, breathless manuals on how to temper fire, when to harvest dew, which hour of the day made mercury less murderous. There were meditations and rituals, sexual abstinence and silence. But at the heart of it all was the pill, red, glowing, possibly fatal. A divine gamble. Sometimes the elixirs were cooked in elaborate furnaces. Sometimes they were brewed in small clay pots, buried underground for months, to ferment. A successful concoction might bubble, hiss, or glow faintly in the dark. That was a good sign. That meant it was working. That meant it could kill the old you. The irony, of course, is that it often did, literally. Death by alchemical elixir wasn't rare. There are records of emperors collapsing mid-meditation, their tongues swollen, their skin red as cinnabar. But this was interpreted not always as failure, but as ascension. The body had been burned clean. The soul had been released. Even in medieval Europe, the concept caught fire. Paracelsus, part doctor, part occultist, insisted that all substances were poison, and only the dose made the difference. He experimented with mercury, antimony, and arsenic. He was the first to suggest that poison, if properly prepared, could cure disease, and perhaps even grant knowledge. His peers called him mad, some called him inspired. The dream was always the same: purifying, transcend. If that required swallowing fire, so be it. If it meant your gums bled and your breath smelled like vinegar and death, then that was simply part of the process. But not all transformations were solitary. In some cultures, the poison wasn't just for you. It was passed around the table, shared, ritualized, and occasionally, it came not in pill or potion, but as smoke, thick, sacred, and aimed at the body's most vulnerable entrance. There are many ways to enter the divine: through dance, through silence, through blood. But in some cultures, the quickest route to the sacred was far less poetic and much more literal: blowing tobacco smoke directly into someone's rectum. No, not as a joke, as treatment, as ritual, as medicine. In the Amazon basin, long before Europeans ever dreamt of cigars, Nicotiana rustica, a potent, nearly hallucinogenic strain of tobacco, was revered, not as a vice, but as a sacred plant. Shamans didn't smoke it to relax. They smoked it to speak to spirits, to purge illness, to protect the body from invisible forces. And sometimes, when the body was too weak, too wounded, or too far gone to inhale, they administered it the other way. Rectal insufflation was the emergency route, when someone had nearly drowned or was unconscious from illness. Tobacco smoke was pumped up the rectum through a hollow reed or tube, often carved, decorated, and spiritually consecrated. The belief was that tobacco's forceful spirit would revive the breath, clear blockages, and frighten off the death spirits clinging to the patient's soul. And sometimes it worked. The nicotine would hit the bloodstream fast, constricting vessels, shocking the nervous system awake. But it wasn't just for emergencies. Among certain peoples of Central and South America, the tobacco enema was a ritual purge, a spiritual scrub. Before vision quests or ceremonies, Participants might undergo a full detox, vomit, sweat, defecate, repeat. Tobacco, taken rectally, didn't just cleanse the gut, it dislodged emotional and spiritual impurities. It brought visions, and it hurt. That was part of the point. When Europeans encountered this practice in the 16th century, they were horrified, and then fascinated. Within decades, tobacco smoke enemas had made their way to Europe, stripped of spiritual context, but kept for utility. In Enlightenment London, bellows and tube kits were hung along the banks of the Thames, ready to revive drowning victims with a well-aimed puff. Manuals were printed, techniques were refined. Even physicians adopted it, as a stimulant, as a cure for colds, as a treatment for melancholia. Of course, it didn't always go well. Some patients didn't survive the shock. Others had burns from overly enthusiastic bellows, but the image of a powdered wigged gentleman briskly blowing tobacco smoke into a stranger's rear while quoting Hippocrates is somehow entirely real. The practice eventually fell out of favor, partly because it didn't always work, partly because it was hard to maintain dignity when caught mid. But the logic behind it, that the body's thresholds are sites of transformation, never disappeared. And in some corners of the world, the ritual use of tobacco, especially in its more potent forms, continues, though not always through the same orifice. But if tobacco was fire, then the next sacred medicine was ice, slow, metallic, revered by saints and swallowed by emperors. Not all poisons are fiery. Some are cold, soft, and deceptively beautiful, like silver, with its celestial gleam, or lead, with its quiet density. While mercury danced and arsenic whispered, these metals weighted heavy, still, powerful in their silence. And across empires and eras, people didn't just fear them, they ate them. Silver, in particular, held divine allure. It was the moon's metal, the purest of substances, capable of repelling evil, preserving purity, and, allegedly, healing the body. Ancient Persians dropped silver coins into water jars to keep the liquid clean, and they weren't wrong. Silver has antimicrobial properties. But then came the next leap. If silver protects the water, maybe it protects the blood. So people began consuming it, shaved into powders, dissolved into tinctures, mixed into elixirs promising immortality. Medieval alchemists swore by colloidal silver, suspending tiny particles of the metal in liquid and drinking it by the vial. They claimed it treated infections, melancholy, even madness. By the Renaissance, it had made its way into royal courts. Nobles with mysterious ailments were given silver salts. Some lived, some turned blue. Argyria, a permanent discoloration caused by silver buildup in the tissues, was seen as a small price to pay for divine protection. Lead, on the other hand, was the workhorse of ancient medicine. The Greeks used it in ointments and wound dressings. The Romans, they went further. Their wine was sweetened with sapper, a syrup boiled in lead pots, laced with lead acetate. It smoothed the flavor and sharpened the headache. Roman nobility consumed so much of it that modern historians have speculated lead poisoning may have played a role in the empire's decline, not metaphorically, but neurologically. But it wasn't just taste. Lead was a binding agent, used in medicinal plasters, suppositories, even eye creams. Its heaviness, its coldness, these were seen as grounding, calming, necessary for balance. The idea was simple. If the body was burning with fever, if the soul was flickering with madness, you needed something dense to hold it down. And then came galena, lead sulfide, often containing traces of silver. In ancient Egypt, it was ground into a fine powder and used as kohl, the iconic black eyeliner worn by gods and mortals alike. More than vanity, it was believed to protect against evil, sun glare, and infection. But every application also introduced trace amounts of lead to the bloodstream. The sacred eye became a slow poison. Yet the weight of these metals was never seen as purely harmful. To be heavy was to be serious. To ingest something that didn't break down, that didn't pass quickly, was to invite stillness, a sort of anchored sanctity. If mercury was movement, silver and lead were gravity. They pulled you inward, down toward the bones, down toward silence. And in that silence, in the tension between decay and transcendence, people found ritual, found purity, found the final medicine that no one wanted, but everyone faced. When all the powders failed, when the tinctures soured, and the metals darkened the tongue, there was one remedy left, the oldest one, the most reliable. It didn't need to be measured, fermented, or whispered over. It arrived every time. Death. But even that wasn't left untouched by medicine. Across cultures, dying wasn't just a biological event, it was a final transformation, a sacred purification, not to be feared, but curated. And poisons, strangely enough, often played a part. In ancient China, if a Taoist monk had ingested enough mercury elixirs to rot from the inside, his followers didn't bury him in shame. They watched, observed the decay, recorded it, sometimes even celebrated it. If the body stayed soft or fragrant, that was a sign of ascension, proof that the toxic path had, in fact, worked. Among Tibetan Buddhists, certain deaths were seen not as loss, but as liberation rituals. The practitioner, often a lama or a mystic, would prepare by fasting, meditating, and swallowing purgative herbs, sometimes toxic ones, to evacuate the body completely. What remained was clean, light, ready to be offered to the birds, or the flames, or the mountain wind. Even in medieval Europe, death had a medicinal aura. Ars moriendi, the art of dying, was a genre of its own, complete with instructions, prayers, and treatments, not to avoid death, but to cleanse the soul on the way out. Enemas of vinegar and herbs, bloodletting to relieve the spirit, bitter tonics to suppress fear. In some cases, small doses of poison, opium, belladonna, hemlock, were used to dull pain, calm the breath, open the gate gently. The final moment was rarely private. In many traditions, it was witnessed, guided, even choreographed. A priest muttering last rites, a shaman singing, a healer pressing herbs against the tongue. And always, the body was positioned, north-facing, curled, stretched, painted, washed, depending on what came next. Burial, cremation, dissection, sky burial, mummification, alchemical combustion. Because in the end, death wasn't defeat. It was the final medicine, the one that reset everything. The one that, paradoxically, gave meaning to all the others. Mercury, arsenic, feces, gold. They were just preparations, reminders, ways to feel the edge before you crossed it. Some believed death was a return, others a doorway, but nearly all believed it should be managed, metabolized with ritual, and, sometimes, with substances so sacred they doubled as poison. And maybe that's the real legacy. That medicine, at its strangest, was never just about health. It was about meaning, about purity, power, control, about what it means to be human in a body that sweats, weeps, burns, and ultimately, stops.